The wind, soft and unsettling, moved through the Frankish hills like a hush meant for someone else's ears. In the deep dusk of a Merovingian century, long before maps could hold names properly, the air was thick with the smell of wood smoke, horses, and wet wool. A fire flickered in a low hearth inside a rough-hewn stone hall, and in the stillness of that early evening, around the year 600, the silence was broken not by sword, not by trumpet, but by the sound of a child coughing in sleep. The kingdoms were supposedly Christian now, or so the bishops insisted. But the woods still whispered the old gods' names. Shadows still knew the Roman roads, even if the people had forgotten them. And power, real power, had nothing to do with crucifixes or coronations. It lived behind doors bolted with rage, and beneath crowns stitched with blood. Welcome, traveler. Before we begin our journey tonight, feel free to settle into your favorite quiet place. Maybe light a candle. Let your breathing slow. If you enjoy deep dives into lost empires and the stories they've tried to bury, consider liking and subscribing. It helps us bring you more of these tales from beneath the dust. Now let's ease into tonight's journey. They fed her the flesh of her own children, the fall of Queen Brunhilda. She wasn't born a monster. She was born in Toledo. In a dusty cradle tucked somewhere between the scent of orange blossoms and the humming discontent of a palace, a baby girl named Brunhilda opened her eyes into a world already barbed with ambition. She was Visigothic royalty, daughter to King Athanagild and Queen Goiswintha, and like all noble children, her earliest lullabies were murmured in the timbre of politics. In the 560s, the Iberian Peninsula was not Spain as we know it, but a fractured confederacy of Gothic warlords, Roman remnants, and Slavic traitors wrapped loosely in the pretense of unity. The Visigoths ruled, technically. They were Arian Christians, heretics, according to the Pope in Rome, and spent more time fighting each other than anyone else. Brunhilda grew up in silk-lined danger. Her childhood, though gilded, was lonely. Her father died before she reached womanhood. Her mother remarried quickly, to her uncle, Livigild, as was the style of dynasties eager to keep bloodlines close and trust even closer. Her half-brother, Hermenegild, would one day rebel and die for the true faith, leaving behind a trail of martyrs and questions. But Brunhilda? She was set aside for marriage. A prize for a foreign court. And that court was Francia. The year was 567 when Brunhilda, at around 17, married King Sigisbert I of Austrasia, a region that roughly translates today into eastern France, western Germany, and Belgium. The marriage was a diplomatic masterstroke. A pagan-turned-Catholic princess wedded to a Merovingian king. Unity, the priest said. Civilization at last. Her wedding was a spectacle. A string of oxen pulled carts of gold across the Rhine. Her veil was so heavily embroidered it nearly snapped her neck. Sigisbert was, by Frankish standards, a decent man, stern, square-jawed, relatively unpoisoned by his dynasty's signature psychopathy. He adored her. Called her his rose, or at least the old Frankish approximation of one. And for a moment, the kingdom believed in love. But that was before Brunhilda's sister arrived. Galswintha. Where Brunhilda was sharp and poised, Galswintha was soft and obedient. Less trained in courtcraft, more trained in quietude. She was married off shortly after Brunhilda, offered like a sacrificial lamb to Chilperic I, Sigisbert's half-brother and rival, who ruled Neustria from the swamps of Soissons. If Sigisbert was a lion on a leash, Chilperic was a dog let loose on meat. He took Galswintha as his wife, praised her dowry, and within a year had her strangled in bed. Some said with his own hands. Others blamed his mistress, Fredegund. And there she is, Fredegund. If Brunhilda was a dagger forged in Visigothic steel, Fredegund was a shard of broken glass pulled from a peasant's boot. She'd started as a servant. A chambermaid. A nobody. But she clawed her way into Chilperic's bed with a cunning that could outstrip a dozen nobles. After Galswintha's death, Fredegund became queen. And Brunhilda declared war. But not immediately. That wasn't her style. Instead, she sat quietly in Metz, the capital of Austrasia, and took stock of her options. She wrote to bishops. She penned furious letters to the Pope. She spun her story of sisterly loss into a tapestry of righteous vengeance. And Sigebert, her husband, with all the warmth of a loyal king and none of the wit to suspect otherwise, took up her cause. Austrasia marched. Neustria responded. The Franks were used to war, but this was different. This wasn't about borders or cattle raids. This was personal. This was sister against mistress. Queen against queen. The people picked sides. Sigebert won, at first. By 575, Chilperic was holed up in Tournai. Sigebert had taken Paris. He was preparing to crown himself king of all the Franks, with Brunhilda beside him, dressed in crimson. But then came the assassins. Sent by Fredegund. 2 men with poisoned daggers stabbed Sigebert in the ribs while he addressed his troops. He died in agony at the height of victory. And Brunhilda? She was captured. Hauled off like loot. Her enemies kept her alive, but barely. They exiled her to Rouen. Shorn of her titles, stripped of her jewels. A widow, a foreigner, a political inconvenience, but not for long. Brunhilda was not the type to fade into obscurity. From her chambers and forced captivity, she seduced Merivek, Chilperic's son, by another woman. A clever, sullen boy. Their union was part passion, part ploy. If she couldn't rule through Sigebert, she would rule through Merivek. It failed. Quickly. Chilperic caught wind of the scandal. Merivek was dragged away and tonsured, his hair cut to mark him as a monk. In the Frankish world, that was worse than death. It meant he could never rule. Brunhilda was exiled again. This time to a monastery. But even monasteries couldn't contain her. She wrote letters again. She plotted. She waited. When Chilperic died mysteriously in 584, stabbed, some said, by a man in a corridor, with Fredegund watching, Brunhilda returned to the court of Austrasia. Her son, Childebert II, was still a child. But with his uncles dead and the throne trembling, she declared herself regent. And that's where the real war began. The Frankish regency was not a role for the meek. It meant power without armor. It meant ruling men who hated women and feared cleverness. But Brunhilda thrived. She restructured roads, revived Roman law, strangled rebellions in their cradles. She even gained the loyalty of Gregory of Tours, the most famous chronicler of the time, though he wrote of her in guarded tones. She held power for 20 years. That doesn't happen by accident. But neither does it happen without leaving corpses. As Childebert grew into his crown, Brunhilda remained behind the throne, his whisperer, his overseer, his advisor in all things. He trusted her. Perhaps too much. She arranged marriages, forged alliances, and dismantled the lingering power of rogue nobles, many of whom had become used to acting like kings themselves. Among them, the powerful mayor of the palace. Now, this title, Mayor of the Palace, sounds domestic. It was anything but. These men were warlords masquerading as bureaucrats. They held the purse strings. They commanded the armies. And the most dangerous among them was a man named Warnakar. But more on him later. First, we need to go back to Fredegund. Because while Brunhilda ruled with a mailed fist, Fredegund ruled with a poisoned needle. Fredegund had remained in Neustria, mother to Chilperic's youngest son, Clotaire II. She had no regency title, no legal claim. But she had the same thing Brunhilda had: ambition. And murder. She orchestrated the deaths of bishops. She had nobles poisoned at banquets. She kept a rotating stable of spies, some of whom, allegedly, were eunuchs trained from childhood to move like shadows. Unlike Brunhilda, Fredegund kept her hands dirty and her ambitions quiet. But in 597, she died. Some say it was illness. Others suggest witchcraft. Either way, her son Clotaire inherited Neustria, and with it, the long-burning feud. Brunhilda now faced a younger, more ruthless version of her old enemy. And he was waiting. In 595, her son Childebert died, some say by poison. His two sons, Theudebert II and Theoderic II, were still boys. So once again, Brunhilda took the reins. Regent. Twice. Few women in early medieval history held that much power. Even fewer held it that long. But her grip was slipping. The Frankish nobles were growing restless. The realm had become a chessboard of assassinations and whispered curses. And Brunhilda, now nearing 60, had made too many enemies to count. She still held the loyalty of Theoderic II, who ruled Burgundy. She despised his brother, Theudebert II, who ruled Austrasia. And in her old age, she decided to do something bold. Reckless. She pitted the brothers against each other. Remember the child coughing in the night? That child had grown up under the weight of a grandmother's legacy. Raised in a palace built of shadows. Taught that trust was for fools. Taught that love was a tool. Theoderic and Theudebert had little chance of surviving childhood whole. And when they turned on each other in civil war, it was Brunhilda pulling the strings. She guided Theoderic's armies against Theudebert. She instructed that his brother be captured, maimed, killed. Theudebert was betrayed, beaten, thrown into chains. His children were slaughtered. And Brunhilda smiled. For the first time in years, she felt safe again. But safety in the Frankish world was always an illusion. And just beyond the Alps, another power was stirring. A boy named Dagobert, son of Clotaire II, grandson of Fredegund. A boy with a lion's name and a serpent's bloodline. He would be Brunhilda's undoing. But not yet. For now she rested. Queen of the Franks. Grandmother to the king. Regent of half the world. But outside her window, the wolves were circling. And some of them walked on two legs. It was a strange peace that followed Theudebert's death, a peace with teeth. Brunhilda stood at the apex of her power. Her grandson, Theoderic II, now ruled both Burgundy and Austrasia, thanks largely to her orchestration. Two kingdoms stitched together with blood and quiet desperation. The nobles bent the knee, if not their hearts. Bishops wrote letters they didn't mean. And the people, as always, toiled under the weight of decisions they would never understand. She ruled not from behind a curtain, but with both hands on the steering wheel of empire. This wasn't the modest regency of earlier years. It was outright command. She issued edicts, appointed judges, reformed tax systems, rode in procession beside her grandson like a second monarch. But power demands repayment, and the Frankish nobility had begun to tally her debts. Especially one family, the Pippinids. In the twisting political maze of Merovingian rule, where kings became mannequins and queens were either pawns or poisoners, one title had grown more potent than royalty itself: mayor of the palace. Initially a house steward, this position had become the real locus of power. The mayor controlled access to the king, oversaw the treasury, and commanded the royal household, effectively, the state. By the early 7th century, they were kingmakers in all but name. And the most dangerous among them now was Pepin of Landen, Pippinid patriarch, quietly observant, with a mind like cold iron and patience to match. Pepin had served under Theudebert II, whom Brunhilda had orchestrated the death of. He had bided his time in the shadows since. His hatred for Brunhilda was not loud or impulsive. It was the long-burning kind. The kind that never needed to forgive. He began forming alliances, old enemies of Brunhilda, families she'd insulted or executed or taxed to the bone. He fed them tales of tyranny, of unnatural influence, of a foreign-born witch queen who had poisoned Frankish virtue and murdered her way to a throne. It didn't take much. The nobles were tired. The wars between brothers had drained their coffers and their fields. Their loyalty had never truly been to the Merovingians, only to the gold and power they could extract from the arrangement. Pepin whispered revolution in the right ears. And they listened. But Brunhilda was not blind. She saw the cracks forming in her mosaic. She felt the air tighten in court meetings. She knew how these stories ended. She had written some of them herself. So she moved preemptively. First, she isolated Pepin. Stripped him of office. humiliated him in a very public session of court by questioning his loyalty and accusing his family of embezzlement. Then she appointed her own candidate, Protadius, a loyalist ambitious, but less capable. He was meant to act as her puppet, but ended up becoming more a symbol of her arrogance. Protadius, as it turned out, was deeply unpopular. Arrogant. Brutal in tax collection. Dismissive of tradition. And worse, he wasn't noble-born. A stain to the pride of men who still called themselves Rex in private. Rebellion brewed in the east. In 606, Brunhilda made a second mistake. Theoderic, her grandson, had grown into a man, headstrong, moody, and increasingly resistant to his grandmother's authority. He wanted to prove himself on the battlefield, to be more than a puppet. And so, against Brunhilda's advice, he launched a military campaign against Theodobert's old allies near the eastern frontier. It was disastrous. The troops, many of them still loyal to their fallen king or angry about Protadius's taxes, mutinied. And in the chaos, Protadius was killed, some say hacked apart by his own men. His body was thrown from a cart. Dogs fed on the remains. Theoderic was shaken. He returned to court not as a victor, but as a man with blood on his crown and rebellion behind his eyes. Brunhilda saw it in his posture. The way he refused her touch. The distance in his voice. He was slipping. Then, in 613, he died. Dysentery, they said? Or poison? Or fever? The chroniclers disagree. But the truth? It didn't matter. He was dead. And with him, Brunhilda's last tether to legitimacy. Now the wolves ran free. Theoderic had left behind 4 sons, all young. None old enough to rule. Brunhilda, without hesitation, declared herself regent again. 3rd time. A grandmother regent in her 70s. Still cunning. Still furious. Still at war. But this time, there was no affection. No illusion of romance or divine right. She had outlived her use to most. And the nobility, led now in full by Pepin and his ally Arnulf of Metz, refused to recognize her authority. They defected. They threw their support behind Clotaire II, Fredegund's son, ruler of Neustria, and once Brunhilda's sworn enemy. The irony was almost poetic. Clotaire had waited for years, nursing grudges and sharpening knives in the long dark. He now marched east with an army filled with traitors and opportunists, and with him rode the promise of a singular kingdom, the first time in decades the Franks would be united under one king. Even the bishops bowed. Because Clotaire, unlike Brunhilda, was predictable. Male. Legitimate. And above all, a vessel for their own ambitions. The end came not with a roar, but a whimper. Brunhilda fled with her great-grandsons, the last flickering hopes of the Austrasian line. They tried to mount resistance near the Jura Mountains, but found no aid. No allies. Even her own soldiers refused to fight. At Lake Neuchâtel, her army melted away. She was captured. The children too. And now, the cruelty began. Clotaire was not merciful. Perhaps he remembered the stories his mother told him, of Brunhilda's wars, her manipulations, the deaths she'd arranged. Or perhaps he simply needed to make an example. He gathered the nobles. Held a tribunal. But no fair trial was offered. They accused her of the murder of 10 kings. Of heresy. Of sorcery. Of manipulating divine will. It was theater. And then came the sentence. Brunhilda's great-grandsons were murdered in front of her. One by one. Each child, a direct descendant of Sigebert and the Merovingian line, was butchered as she was forced to watch. The youngest was 8. The oldest 10. Some say she wept silently. Others say she screamed so loud the mountains echoed. But no one came to help. Then Clotaire turned to her. Her execution was to be public. They tied her to a wild horse. Some say it was 4 horses, 1 for each limb. Others say 1 horse dragged her by the hair. She was paraded through the camp first. Mocked. Spat upon. Her hair torn out in tufts. Her face cut to ribbons by guards eager to impress. Then the horse was whipped. It bolted. Brunhilda's body was pulled across the rocks and dirt until it came apart. Her skull, they say, cracked open like a melon. Her limbs dislocated. Her skin flayed. At the end, there was nothing left but a torn red ruin, a queen turned into carrion. And the crowd cheered. Not because they hated her, necessarily, but because they were afraid not to. And because that's how history is written, in blood, in applause, and in the silence that follows. Brunhilda's legacy was nearly erased. The chroniclers, many in service to Clotaire and his descendants, painted her as a harlot, a foreign witch, a usurper. They made her into a cautionary tale. A woman who wanted too much. Who ruled too long. Who forgot her place. But behind the myths and slanders, something else remains. A woman who ruled longer than any Frankish king of her time. Who held empires together with ink, with threat, with brilliance. Who outlived her enemies. Who raised generations of rulers. Who dared to be more than decoration in a brutal age. They fed her the flesh of her own children. But they could not digest her memory. The grass grew back eventually. Not right away, of course. Where the blood had soaked into the soil outside Reneve, it took years before even weeds dared show themselves. But in time, the land forgot, or pretended to. That's the strange thing about places. They don't carry memory the way people do. They cover it, like moss over an old wound. The Frankish kingdoms were united now. Clotaire too had everything he wanted. Austrasia, Burgundy, Neustria, all his, glittering in their fractured glory like a crown made of broken glass. He declared peace. He called himself Rex Totius Francorum, king of all the Franks. He even issued a great edict, the Edict of Paris, 614, in which he promised justice, reformed the bureaucracy, and placated the nobility with lands and flattery. But you don't build peace on butchered children. And beneath the polished veneer of royal order, the world Brunhilda left behind began to stir with new violence. The noble family she once held at bay, the Pippinids, the Arnulfings, rose from the ashes like vultures fattened on her corpse. They remembered. Not with grief, but with ambition. With cold calculation. The sons of Pepin, the kin of Arnulf of Metz, began to whisper dreams of a different future. One not ruled by Merovingian blood at all. Because Clotaire, for all his power, was just a man. And time moves forward, indifferent to crowns. Dagobert, Clotaire's son, took up the mantle next. Clever, well-educated, fond of baths and astronomy, he was a different sort of king, less sword, more scroll. For a while it worked. He held the kingdom together with Roman-style efficiency, and under him, art and scholarship flickered back to life like hesitant candle flames. But even Dagobert could not stop what was coming. The Merovingians had sown their own destruction in the soil of their success. Kings had become symbols. The real power now rested elsewhere. In the halls of mayors. In the hands of men like Pepin of Herstal. His son, Charles Martel. And one day, a grandson named Pepin the Short, who would crown himself king in defiance of a Merovingian puppet and usher in a new dynasty altogether. The Carolingians. And Brunhilda? History forgot her for a time. Or rather, she was made into something grotesque. The church chroniclers called her Jezebel. A harlot queen. A pagan in Christian robes. They ignored her reforms, her letters, her vision. They remembered her as a warning. Not a woman. But across time, something strange happens. The dead speak again. Her letters survived. Fragments of them, at least. Diplomatic, detailed, laced with steel and charm. She wrote to emperors, to popes, to bishops. She had vision. Not just for conquest, but for order. For roads that worked and courts that judged fairly. She built hospitals. Enforced Roman law in a world going feral. She made kings. Even her enemies had to admit, she was more than a queen. She was a force. And so we return, gently, to the firelight. Imagine the slow crackle of wood burning down to embers. The scent of rain lifting from the stones outside. A horse tethered nearby, snorting softly in the dark. No armies. No screams. Just stillness now. History is often cruel, yes. But in the quiet after, there is room for something softer. A breath. A whisper. The recognition of complexity. Brunhilda was not innocent. She was not kind. But she was alive, brilliantly, stubbornly, fatally alive, in a world that asked women to die quietly. And she did not. So tonight, as the shadows stretch and the world softens, let us hold her memory gently. Not to excuse. Not to condemn. But simply to remember her whole. The way the grass does. The way time, eventually, always will.